Hi, Radhika. Thanks a lot for taking time and talking to us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, for people who are not familiar with your work, can I ask you to introduce yourself, the body of work that you've done so far?
Sure. So my background is that I've been an entrepreneur. I've been building products for so many years. I've had four exits that I've been part of, two of which were companies that I founded. And then more recently, I've been working with the Central Bank of Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. I've also been working in so many different industries over the last 20 years. In fact, I guess the theme in my bio would be that I've never held two consecutive jobs in the same industry. So I've worked in broadcast, media and entertainment, telecom, advertising, even wine. But kind of what brings it all together for me is that this range of experience has made me realize that product is not just a function in a company. It's not just a role of product management. Product really is a way of thinking and a philosophy. And product is how we create change in the world. And that is really what's reflected in my book.
Yeah, so that's just so that as a background, the reason why we are having this conversation is I got a chance to read Radhika's book, an advanced copy of Radhika's book. Thanks to NetGalley for allowing me to do that. And I really, really liked what I read. I made tons of notes, and that's the conversation that we are going to have today. So before we move ahead, uh, you spoke about the fact that product is not just features functionality, it's a way of thinking, right? So is that where you started with, or is that the place where you've ended up? And if that's the place where you have ended up, um, what led you to think that way?
Yeah, I think it's a place where I ended up. Because I think when I started my career, product management wasn't really a thing at the time, like 20 years ago. And so how I ended up there is, I had realized that I was building products, whether it was at a startup or in a larger company. And what made me realize that it's a way of thinking and not a title is when I worked at Avid. My title at the time was the diametric opposite of what you would consider product management. My title at the time was it was program manager for custom engineering, which is about as different as product as you can get, right? But what was my role actually? We were building our broadcast business at the time. Avid was well known in the movie industry. So practically every movie that was ever made that won an Oscar had used Avid for video editing. But at the time, we were new to broadcast, and Sony was the dominant player. They had completely cornered the market in every aspect of broadcast, from tapes that they were using to storage and everything else. And so when we were entering the market, it wasn't this idea of let's just try what works and try different things. The person who was heading up that business, David Schleifer, and I wrote about this in the book, he had a clear vision for broadcast. And I was really new to the company, new early in my career even, right? And I really saw the impact of having a really clear vision and then thinking about, how are we going to make this vision come alive? The first suite of products that we had was small. It was editor, but, storage and media management put together. And then we grew this from there on. And my role at Avid was talking to customers to figure out what they needed. If it was truly custom, we would convince customers that, look, this is just going to detract us or distract us from, growing the business in a way that is strategic and gives you a product suite that is sustainable and easy for us to grow, right? We'll give you some custom features, but it's hard for us to continue to support that in the long run. And so we would convince them to either make adjustments to their workflow, but where possible, to kind of buy into our vision and then support us by, also paying for some of this functionality and building on. So what was supposed to be custom engineering became, really strategic work. And then we continued to build our product suite and grow it. And in the span of just 5 years, we won every major broadcast company that was there. And so this experience made me realize, product isn't about this title, or it's just a way of thinking so that we can very strategically think about what customers need, what's the change we're trying to create in the market, and then finding, sometimes it's even creative ways to make that vision come alive in our actions.
Yeah, I think there are two things that stand out to me in the story that you talk about in Avid. Number one is the fact that, and you talk about this in using multiple cases in the book as well, which is number one, how just iterating based on market realities in the moment tends to harm the product or the organization in the long run. And the second, which is diametrically opposite, which is to have a vision, a clear vision in terms of a problem that you're trying to solve or the change that you want to make in the world. And how do you progress from where you are to achieving that vision and taking the next logical step possible in terms of going towards the vision, and rather than just looking at local. You talk about this local maxima versus global maxima. So that's a thing that a lot of people who understand theory of constraints know really well. Manufacturing world knows about local maxima and global maxima. I've not seen that in the software world as much as I would like to. I mean, so talk to us a little bit about where does that philosophy of local optima versus global maximum or global optimum comes into picture from your experience, and when did you figure out if there is an experience or if there is a lack of experience in terms of that iterative product building based on short-term metrics only leads organization astray.
Yeah, maybe let's, for listeners, start by defining local maxima versus global maximum. Think of a chessboard that you're playing on. So if you're playing chess, what you have to keep thinking about is the best move across the whole chessboard. You're optimizing across the whole chessboard to find the best moves, and you're playing the long game. You're finding the global maximum for every move, right? Whereas the local maximum that you could be playing in a chess game is perhaps as an inexperienced player, where you focus on just one corner of your chessboard. You look at your pieces that are under attack, and you're just focusing on optimizing for those few pieces. A really good chess player isn't thinking about just one or two chess pieces. They may sacrifice those pieces to really find that global maximum. And so when we build our businesses, we're doing something very similar. What happens is we could optimize for the local maximum, which might be, the revenue for next quarter or the revenue for the year. We might be optimizing for things that are popular metrics, such as, daily number of active users or the time your users are spending on site. Or rather than thinking about these local maxima that may help you in the short term, we're thinking about the global maximum, which is that, are we creating the end scenario that we really want to see? And to be able to even create the end scenario, you need to know what is the end scenario that you want. In chess, it's very clear because the end scenario that you're trying to work towards is checkmate. Whereas, in the line of business that we're in, this was the piece that I found missing. Like, there is nothing that really teaches you how do you define what is that end scenario that you're building towards. And this was what I started seeing repeatedly in my career, that whenever in business, we created vision statements. Our vision statements were very broad because this is how we learned to build vision statements, or this was what we always thought a good vision statement was. And for years we've learned that a good vision statement starts with, to be the leader in blah, blah, blah. Or, think about all the startups that have vision statements that talk about, I want to be a $1 billion company by doing blah. We've always learned that a good vision statement is about our own goals. And this is where, I think over time, having worked across all of these different industries and sizes of companies, what I found was we were making the same set of mistakes over and over. And just what we have in terms of methodologies that we have available, that's just not making things better. It's not that now that we have lean and agile, that we're building significantly more successful products than we were, 20 years ago. It's not that the rate of failures of startups has now suddenly dropped or something like that. Things are pretty much status quo. What lean and agile have given us is the ability to build faster. And as companies have adopted them, they've learned how to iterate better and go faster. And this is the analogy that I use, that's like having a fast car where, we can drive fast, but what's the point of driving fast when you don't know where you're going? And so radical product thinking, I realized, was needed because we need a different way of thinking about what is the end state that we envision. And then how do you translate that picture in your mind of the end state into your everyday activities? Because, and I talk about this in my book, which is there are product diseases that come about. What happens is whenever you either don't have a clear vision or there's a break in the chain between your vision down to your everyday actions, that's where product diseases crop up. And this approach and this methodology is so that we can avoid product diseases and build successful products that change the world.
Interesting that you bring up the product diseases. So you talk about what, 5 diseases, if I remember correctly. So tell me, which one do you think is the most prevalent, and or the one which can be easily addressed? You can pick whichever question you want to answer.
Yeah, so there are about 7 diseases actually.
7.
And I think it really depends on whether you're a small company or a big company as to which disease is the most common that I come across. For startups, I think probably the most common disease is pivotitis. And pivotitis is the disease where, we just go about trying one strategy after another. Unfortunately, what we've learned, right, is that as a startup, you should be pivoting. Try something. If it doesn't work, switch to something else, but be quick to pivot, right? Fail fast, learn fast is what we've learned. But the reality is this model really came out of the venture capital business model. The way the venture capital business model works is they just need one startup out of 10 to succeed because they invest in so many companies. And so for a startup, the risk of trying so many things is pretty high. But the whole point of the VC business model is go big or go home because of how their business model works. And so they want you to diversify and try lots of things so that one of those things might work well. Whereas from a startup's perspective, the reality is you have 2 to 3 pivots before you run out of either money or momentum. Money meaning just how you're funded, but momentum because your team is going to get tired of switching directions and completely lose motivation. So pivotitis is one thing where you can avoid that by starting with a clear vision for the change that you want to bring. Now, a lot of pushback that I get from startups is, but I don't know whether something is a valid problem in the world or not. I'm discovering it. Isn't that the whole point of being lean and agile, that you're discovering your vision along the way? And here's what I'd say to that. Even if you're discovering the problem, and that's completely valid as an early stage startup, put a stake in the ground as to what you think the problem is. Write a really clear vision statement, the way I talk about in the book, which is using this fill in the blank statements that answers some profound questions. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But create the stake in the ground of what you think the problem is. And then think about your execution as a way of validating and proving out that vision and strategy. And so you may discover that you were completely wrong about the stake in the ground, and that's okay. And the good thing is you will rewrite your vision statement based on what you've learned. And this prevents pivotitis, interestingly enough, because it's not just a wild swing from one thing to another. You're bringing your whole team with you on the journey where you show them, look, here's what we wrote last time for vision. Here's what we discovered. Here's how it needs to change. So it feels so much more purposeful. You're not just throwing away these 2 to 3 pivots that you have. It feels like you're not losing momentum. People appreciate your leadership, that you're very thoughtful and deliberate about why you're making changes. So pivotitis is the most common disease for startups. On the other hand, for a large company, one of the most common diseases, especially if your product actually is successful, is locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome is where, maybe your product is making money and you keep having to meet revenue goals every quarter. So what do? You just add maybe a few tweaks to your product, maybe just another feature. You're just continuing to iterate on that same product, and it becomes, this milking the cash cow. And I guess the biggest example of milking this cash cow was the disastrous Boeing 737 MAX. that killed so many people. The reason I use that as an example of locked-in syndrome was, engineers had been iterating on the 737 platform for about 40 years. And they knew that it was outdated. But Boeing had a choice. Either they could invest a lot, like many, many, many billions, in starting on a new plane from scratch that was a narrow body plane, kind of like they did for the Dreamliner. But they thought, well, instead of, and that was the original plan, by the way, but they kept pushing that down the road to continue to iterate on the 737 platform to deliver on the short-term goals. So it was locked-in syndrome because they were locked into this platform that was a brilliant cash cow for them, their best-selling platform, in fact. But then Airbus introduced the A320 Neo, which was, I think 20% more efficient in terms of fuel efficiency. And that's where some of their customers started to switch to the Airbus A320 Neo. And so Boeing 737 MAX was conceived as a way of stemming all these losses of customers going over to their competitor. And that's how, they put a larger engine under the 737 MAX, under the 737 platform, just to be able to, make it more fuel efficient. But putting a larger engine on this smaller plane just made it aerodynamically unstable. And so they created software to get around this aerodynamic instability. And that was the MCAS system that they had built. And that MCAS system is what led to the two crashes of Indian Airlines and Lion Airways.
There is a lot of lessons in there for both successful large organizations as well as startups. I have people who know me and who have listened to the show for any length of time know very well that I'm one of those people who strongly feel that it is important that any success that an organization sees in a particular product immediately needs to start looking at what's the next platform going to be. Ideally for a same set of customers or for a different set of customers, depending upon which business you want to be in. But if you think of success as an S curve, the moment you hit the upward growth trajectory, that's when you need to start making your bets for the next S curve coming up. Because what I've seen is once you start seeing success and you start iterating on the same platform as Boeing that you said, and as a lot of organizations do that, and kind of continue to milk their cash cow to the extent that that becomes their biggest risk, because anything that can actually take customers away from your cash cow then becomes a huge threat for your organization, because there's nothing else available, or there is nothing else which is kind of growing or in that growth trajectory at all, and which leads you to become more defensive. It leads you to more doing stuff which are ridiculous in hindsight and also in the present moment. Yeah, I mean, that's a different rant that I've been having for a long time now. Long time listeners of this show would remember me talking about this many times with many different people. So thanks a lot for bringing that about. So let's come back to the book and the book title itself. So you call the book Radical Product Thinking. Whereas my personal opinion about the book is that it is not a book about product thinking. It is a book about leadership and leadership thinking, because that's the sense that I get when I read the entire book, that it is a leadership book. So why call it Radical Product Thinking and not call it leadership as such?
One of the, and you're right, I'm so glad that you recognize it as a leadership book as opposed to just product. One of the things that I was trying to get people to realize is, whatever you're doing in the world, you're building a product. And the thing is about your products, they affect people. And so we have to recognize that we are all building products. And that was kind of the key message from the book. And what you'll see in the conclusion chapters, as you've seen, but for the listeners, like in the conclusion chapters, the examples that I use of products are not traditional products of software or hardware at all. It's about people creating change in the world through, either activism, perhaps their job, or changing an entire ecosystem in the financial space, as that was the example of the head of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Ravi Menon, and how he's looking to make finance a force for good. But the point is that, radical product thinking really helps us realize that we are all building products that affect people. The way we can do this is very systematically instead of just being iteration led. But finally, the fact that we now have this methodology to be able to systematically create successful products also means that with the superpower comes the burden of responsibility that we really have to embrace. And in the book, I talk about digital pollution and how we need to make sure that we're building products that don't add to digital pollution or create collateral damage to society.
Yeah, so we'll come to the digital pollution in a bit. You spoke about the methodology, right? So you talk about the methodology in the book, which is the core of the book itself. So can you just explain what that methodology is?
Yeah. So, what the first thing that we were talking about in terms of how do you find the global maximum instead of local maximum, I mentioned how you need a vision for the end state that you want to bring about. Like, what is your version of checkmate, in the world, right? And it's not a win-lose game. In our case for business, like hopefully you're trying to create a world that works for all. But what exactly does that mean? And that's the starting point of radical product thinking. Very clearly defining the end state that you want to bring about. And I mentioned, how a vision statement isn't a slogan or, this BHAG, which is a big, hairy, audacious goal that's just, your aspirations of being $1 billion company. It has to be about a problem that you want to see solved. So I talk about, starting with a vision where you answer 5 questions, which really get to the profound depths of what problem are you addressing. So the first question is, whose world are you trying to change? And realize that you're not trying to change the world for everyone. What does their world look like? Meaning, what exactly is their problem? Why does that need solving? Or, why do you even need to change the world? And we have to be cognizant of the fact that maybe it doesn't need changing. Then you can talk about the when question, which is when will you know that you've arrived? So that's, to describe what does the world look like so that you know you've arrived? And then finally, the 5th question is how will you bring about that world? So that's where you can describe your product, your technology, or your approach to be able to bring about that world. And what I found is, right, even when you have to answer these who, what, why, when, and how questions, it's really hard to start with a blank sheet of paper. And so the radical product thinking approach gives you a Mad Libs or a fill in the blank statement where you can do this as a group exercise where you're not stuck on wordsmithing, which is often the problem with vision statements. Instead, you're really focusing on answering these profound questions together. So that's the first step, right? And then the next step is, well, you have a vision, then you start to craft a strategy. And in this strategy, you can create a set of actionable steps that help your vision come alive. And so in answering your strategy, you answer 4 questions, which is, what's the pain that makes someone come to your product? What's your solution in the product? Meaning, what's the design that solves that pain? The 3rd question is, what's your capability, like your special sauce that you need to be able to power this design? And then finally, like, what is logistics, which is how will you deliver this product to your customers? This is where you think about your pricing model, support, training, etc. Often, by the way, this last piece is what is forgotten in building a product. It's thought of as an afterthought, like, oh, let me first get traction, then I'll monetize my product. And so when you leave out this question, right, it's like saying, I'm going to build a house, but you're not thinking about, is it a 4-person family, or is it, a young couple that you're building this house for? You can't build a house with white carpets for a 4-person family with 2 little kids, right? And so we cannot just leave out this question of how do you support, train your customers, what are your sales channels, etc., as an afterthought. It has to kind of be designed into your product. So that's strategy. And then we go into priorities. How do you bring a vision and strategy into your everyday decisions? Because by the way, this is where product diseases often come out. Even if you have a good vision and strategy, we forget about it when we have the urgent needs of our everyday business, just urgencies that come up. Your customer might demand something, your CEO wants to see revenue results, etc. Like, how do you bring your vision and strategy into everyday decisions? And then finally, it's about execution and measurement, so that you use execution and measurement to really validate your vision and strategy, and so that you measure what matters, not just revenues and time spent on site, which are important, by the way. I'm not saying ignoring them, but at the same time, we have to measure success in a way that's really derived from your vision and strategy. And then the last step in this whole methodology is the culture that you have in your team. Because for you to be able to do innovation really differently, you need a culture that allows for that. And you can very systematically engineer the culture where your team can do their best work together. And in this book, I talk about how you can do that very systematically using some of these same ideas of vision, strategy, prioritization, and execution and measurement. So those are the 5 elements, but I covered them really quickly. I'd love to hear your thoughts and kind of where we can expand for our listeners.
Before we expand, I think one of the things that was really brought a sparkle in my eyes when I was reading your book was the story of Lijjat Pappad. I grew up with Lijjat Pappad. I still love having my Lijjat Pappads. So if you can just use that story in terms of how they conceptualized and where they are and how they have kind of personified the methodology that you just spoke about, and then we'll probably go deeper into one of those aspects once you've done that.
Perfect. Yeah. Just writing about the Lijjat Pappad story, that really that really made my day to, it was just so rewarding. I can't tell you. Even my editor, who's working on that section, at the end, she sent me an email, and there were other people who were working on the book who read this part, and they said, they now started to buy Lijjat Pappad and had a whole list of flavors that they wanted to try. So, okay, for our listeners, let me tell the story, because not everyone knows kind of how the story of Lijjat Pappad. So, okay, so Lijjat is the brand for pappadams or pappad. So, and for our listeners in the West, like pappads are or pappadam is what they call it here in the US. It's the lentil crackers that you often eat with chutney in restaurants. And so the brand that has 60% market share around the world is Lijjat. And the way the company, it's not a company, it's more like a cooperative. The way this organization came about was it started with a group of 7 women who came from really poor households. They weren't really educated, so their prospects of finding a job were really limited. They felt like the only skill that they really had was cooking as a skill. And so they wanted to earn a dignified living. They didn't want to be dependent on their husbands in this very patriarchal society. They wanted to be able to have a dignified living so that they could contribute to their household income and educate their kids. And so they started by saying, okay, given that cooking is our one skill, that they would start to make pappads and then sell those to stores. And so they started off on the terrace of their building, and they decided from the beginning that their vision was really about giving financial independence to women. So they would all be equal partners. They would never take charity, and they would always split the profits or losses, whatever the results are, across all the partners equally. And so the 7 of them started this way. Very soon, the pappads that they were making, they really took off. They started growing from 7 women to 25. Soon it was, 100. Then it got to 300 at the end of the first year, and they weren't fitting on the same terrace anymore. So then they expanded so that, everyone was rolling pappads at home and bringing it back. And so as this organization kept growing, they started to, set up operations in a way that logistically all these women could roll pappads at home. And then, they would take the dough in the morning, bring back the rolled pappads the next day, and the cycle would continue, and they would get paid on an everyday basis. So what makes this absolutely incredible, right, is First of all, they're now at 45,000 women who all are equal partners and share in the profits and losses equally. The kind of, it just baffled me to think, like, can you think about a law firm where everyone is sharing equally in profits and losses, regardless of how long they've been there in seniority and how much work I'm putting in versus you're putting in? It just sounds unfathomable. And yet this just works. And so a lot of this, the way that this whole cooperative works is because it's so vision driven. That vision that started with those 7 founders has grown to 45,000 because it's driven by this very clear picture of being able to create change for all of these women and give them financial independence. And then it was systematically translated into action. If you think about their strategy, right, one of the key pain points for these women is they are the primary caregivers at home. So meaning that they had elders and kids to take care of. Because of this patriarchal family, it wasn't going to be allowed that they would go and work in an office or go work in a factory and then come back in the evening. That just, like, they wouldn't have engaged so many women if that were the case. And so these women, the way the entire operational setup is developed. So this is the second part of strategy, which is design. So the real pain point is the fact that women have to work at home. The solution or the design is the fact that they created an operational setup that allows for this logistics to happen, where they actually let you work from home and you roll pappads at home and they bring it back. But to power that solution, right, they needed some capabilities. They really needed this sort of, they needed buy-in from all the women to make sure that their quality was good. One of the things that makes Lijjat what it is today in terms of this phenomenal brand is their quality. They're just known for quality in pappads. And you kind of, it boggles the mind to think that 45,000 women are rolling pappads at home. It creates so much possibility for there to be huge fluctuations in quality. And yet, like, the fact that it all that their quality is so good is because women are so bought into this vision that anytime they see an issue with either the dough or whatever it is, they themselves are so picky about quality. All of that comes from the capabilities that they've built of women being bought in. They sign this pledge form when they come in, talking about how they're doing this as a way of creating a dignified living for everyone. They sign up to these principles like, I'm not going to think about who's getting more than me or not. I'm going to think about this differently, that I want everyone to get a lot, and so on. And so finally, in terms of logistics, right, their whole business model had to be driven by this model of being able to pay women every day, because if they weren't paid every day, their families weren't going to be so accepting of them working. Secondly, they wouldn't have as much say in the household spending if they didn't have money every single day. And so by paying them every day, they ensured that they had a say in household income. But that also meant that Lijjat does not take credit or give credit. Every account is settled immediately. And so this became their way of business. So their entire strategy, the RDCL of real pain points, design, capabilities, and logistics, was derived from their vision and really aligned with their vision. And it shows up in their priorities, and then it shows up in how they measure success. One of the things that really struck me is, most companies would measure success by what are your revenues, and Lijjat has good revenues. Like, they're more than $220 million. That was 2 years ago when I interviewed them, annual revenues per year, and that's US dollars. But that's not how they measure success. They have 60% market share, but that's not how they measure success. They have one metric by which they measure success, which is the number of women to whom they give financial independence. And by the way, this doesn't mean that revenues, et cetera, are not important. In fact, like, if they didn't have good market share, if they didn't have good revenues, they can't support as many women getting financial independence. So those are important elements, but that's not the measure of success. Because if you just measured revenues or market share as your way of success, you would just build up a factory setup where the entire factory is about optimizing for revenues and optimizing for profits, but that's not what they did. They created change in the world through their product. And that was like what was phenomenal to me. Pappad just happens to be their product to create the change that they wanted to create for all of these women. And they gave 45,000 women financial independence through Pappads, which were their product.
Yeah, I think very well said. I personally feel that financial independence for women is their product. The Papad is just a way to bring that product alive. So that's the way I kind of think at it. So thanks a lot for sharing that story. I think it was a story which needed to be told, and thanks for telling that in such a great way that you do in the book as well. So one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about recently is around culture. So everyone I talk to has a different definition of culture. The scientific literature talks about culture in a totally different way, whereas day-to-day vernacular and in our day-to-day practical experience, we experience and talk about culture in a very different way. So, what according to you is the definition of culture, and how important a role do you think the culture plays in bringing this entire methodology that you spoke about to life?
Yeah, so I agree with you that culture is defined so differently, even from one person to the next, right? And that is one of the problems why it's so hard in a company to talk about we need a culture change. And you just see eye rolls from people like, oh God, here we go again, right? Because it's not clear what that means exactly. What is the culture change you want? What is our culture today, and what are you trying to get to? It all sounds very fluffy. Like you might say, oh, we need a more open culture, a more transparent culture. But what exactly does that mean? And that's the part that was very nebulous. And so in the radical product thinking approach to culture, where we can do our best work all together, the way I talk about culture is that we experience culture on two dimensions. That's how I really define culture. The two dimensions are whether work is fulfilling or not. That's one dimension. The second is whether work is urgent or not urgent. And so once you drop this 2 by 2, you see there are 4 quadrants. The tasks that are fulfilling and not urgent, those are the most meaningful tasks. So a lot of the work in radical product thinking, you're thinking about the vision, strategy, stuff that feels meaningful. Your actions are connected to your vision and strategy. You feel like your decisions, they're helping you achieve what you set out to. All of that feels really meaningful. So that's meaningful work. The quadrant where you're doing work that's fulfilling, but it's urgent, I call that the heroism quadrant, because that's work that is fulfilling, but because it's urgent, it adds some spice to your day. Like if you're firefighting to save a customer from something, right? Or a bug that's crashing their system. Okay, you're firefighting urgently. It adds spice to your day. But if your every day is just filled with heroism, you're on the fast path to burnout. The next quadrant is where work is not fulfilling, but it feels urgent. This is where, you have to do a lot of administrative paperwork. Like it has to get done. Maybe you have to do a lot of reporting in your job where you have to report on these 15 different metrics every single day. Someone at Amazon was telling me how, they spend 10 to 15 hours a week on just reporting on a lot of metrics. And it was just exhausting. They felt like they didn't really have time to create change. They were reporting so much. So that quadrant is what I call organizational cactus. Especially as we start to grow, it becomes this quadrant where you feel like you're trudging through this minefield of cactus. It's slow and painful. And the last quadrant is one where work is not fulfilling, And it's not urgent. This is like a low-grade fever that just goes on, and that's the soul-sucking quadrant. The soul-sucking quadrant is where stuff feels unfair. You're upset and not fulfilled because you feel like you cannot talk openly at work. You have to self-censor. If you disagree with your boss, you're worried that there might be repercussions. Having to play politics, feeling like you're not paid equally as your colleagues. All of those are soul-sucking things. So what do you think of as a good culture? To me, a good culture is one which maximizes the meaningful work quadrant and it minimizes the other three danger quadrants. There is no workplace where the danger quadrants are absolutely zero. We all experience, small amounts of time in the other quadrants, hopefully small amounts of time in other quadrants, and hopefully the meaningful work quadrant is good. If you are lucky to be working in such an environment, you are in a great work culture. And so when we talk about what is our vision for culture, this is the kind of detail that we need to get to. This is the end state of what is a good culture. And so the vision for culture is what I described, having this big meaningful work quadrant and smaller other quadrants. Then you create a strategy for how will you get there. This requires open discussions within the team to be able to talk about each of these quadrants and what tasks are you doing that requires you to spend time in the danger quadrants. And then thinking about how we can minimize the size of those quadrants. Then you think about how you can bring that into your everyday decisions, your priorities. And then finally, measuring whether you're making progress. You can measure culture where you can do very simple surveys, not those, long and boring things that you do once every 6 months. You can do like 4 or 5 questions on the top problems that you're addressing on even a weekly basis to see have things gotten better on a weekly basis, right? And then finally, when you apply this whole approach, these discussions, you'll find that they're more of a bonding experience than any team bonding exercise or games you can do. Like I've just found that this makes the team feel like a team when you can have these open discussions and talk about, where you're spending time, what feels like it's soul sucking, how much time you're spending in heroism and operational organizational cactus. It'll just make you feel closer as a team through these open discussions.
Very, very well said. I think one of the challenges that I have seen in organizations and startups and in large organizations is when you talk about culture, they only look at the outward look of having a cool place, having some rides, or having some food, free food, or bean bags, and all the outward appearance is what people typically look at when they look at culture. They forget about the fact that culture is living, breathing inside of each one of the employees that work in the organization, and that needs to come alive. And for that to come alive, for the employees to come alive, the culture needs to come alive. And it, as you said, people should feel that what they're doing, what they feel, what they say matters. They need to be, they should feel seen, they should feel heard, and they should feel as if they matter. And that is what I think is a good culture, where people can feel all these three. Then that's a great culture, at least according to me.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up this point of how we often address culture through beanbags and free food and things like that. I really think of that as an iteration-led approach to culture. Again, it's the local maxima as opposed to the global maximum. And it happens because we're being reactive to culture. By giving people, sleep pods and beanbags and free food, that's, kind of reacting to people being unhappy and giving them these things. And it can maybe make things a little bit better and feel hip in the short term, but the more vision driven approach is really thinking about in this holistic way, where you have a vision for what actually a good culture is, as opposed to reacting and trying to make things incrementally better by offering free food and laundry services in the company.
So one of the challenges that I see, and I see this every single day in every interaction that I do with everyone that I come in contact with, that what you're asking us to do is difficult work, and which requires deliberate thinking, the need to be how do I put it, intentional about what we are doing and why we are doing something, which is hard. Same thing, culture and having this vision and kind of, going through your methodology, coming up with a vision which is and a problem that is worth solving is hard. And that is probably why a lot of people do not do that work. So the question then I have for you is, uh, what do we do about that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, and you're so right. I think that is precisely the problem that makes that gets in the way of being vision driven to start with. That we don't have time, the mental bandwidth or the mental energy to be able to uh, engage in this sort of vision driven approach. And so, one of the first things is in an organization, at a leadership level, we really have to think about, are we giving people enough time in this meaningful work quadrant to be able to have this mental space to be able to focus on the vision? One of the things that happens often in organizations is this perspective that, look, at a leadership level, we're thinking about the vision and strategy. Everyone else is executing, right? And that is one of the fundamental mistakes that we make in leadership. The reality is, no matter where in the company you are, everyone needs a vision for their work. Like if they have a vision for their work and how it contributes to the company's vision, they're going to be so much better at what they do. We need to give everyone that mental bandwidth to be able to be vision driven, and bring that vision, the company's vision, into their everyday decisions and what they implement or their activities that they take on. So that's the first step. As a leadership team, are we giving people enough time? From the second, from the opposite side, like if you're an employee at one of these companies and you feel like you really don't have the mental bandwidth, here's one of the first things that you can do to start to be vision driven. And by the way, you'll find it so much more rewarding to, to kind of navigate your way to this more strategic role. One of the first things you can do is, just for yourself, take some time away from the busyness of work. Give yourself like some quiet space for a few hours and start to write out your vision statement for your particular product or whatever you're working on. Right? Write out a vision statement using this fill in the blank statement that I talked about. Then you can craft your strategy. Do this for yourself. And then one of the ways you can introduce this vision into your everyday work, you can sneak it into discussions with your team by using this 2x2, which is an X and a Y axis in your decisions. So for example, what happens is, we don't have time to think about the vision and strategy as much, but now that you've had time to think about it, the way you can introduce it is when everyone's executing. Like, for example, most probably you're part of some agile sprint, or you're part of some decision making where you're talking about, should we do this or should we not do this? When you're in that sort of a decision, drop an X and a Y axis. Your Y axis is this a good vision fit or is this not a good vision fit? Your x-axis is this helping you survive in the short term or is it not helping you survive in the short term? And so something that's good for the vision and helping you survive in the short term, those are the easy decisions. That's the ideal stuff. But if you're always focused on this, remember that you're still always being short-term focused. So sometimes to find the global maximum that we talked about, you have to be investing in the vision. That's where it's good for the vision, but it's not helping you short-term. So think about, let's say you have to refactor code for 3 months, you're investing in the vision. The opposite of investing in the vision is where you're taking on vision debt. This is where it's not, it's helping you survive in the short term, but it's not good for your vision. And so the more of this that you do, the more you catch the disease that I call obsessive sales disorder. It's taking you further and further away from your vision. But, maybe it's making you lots of revenues, at least in the short term, right? So you're kind of making this short-term exchange of vision in exchange for these gains. The way you can use this is by drawing things up on this 2x2. You get in your sprint make decisions based on what's the right balance of short-term versus long-term. In this sprint, perhaps you're able to take on some investing in the vision, or maybe in the sprint, you have to take on this vision debt, but recognize as a team that this is what you're doing. And so by talking about it, you start to introduce this idea of vision versus survival and these trade-offs. By starting to introduce these concepts, you'll get other people hooked on a more strategic way of thinking. You can sneakily use this in your leadership meeting when you're talking about priorities and what you're going to take on. Look, can we please not do this feature because it's vision debt? You introduce these concepts. And that slowly, from a grassroots level, starts to spread within the organization in terms of vision-driven thinking, so that you can have these discussions of, well, you drew up this X and Y axis of vision versus survival. What does vision mean? What exactly is our vision? And then you can start to do this as a group exercise, and you talk about the who, what, why, when, and how questions. So the first step is for an employee, just take some time off to think about the vision and strategy, and then how you'll introduce this X and Y axis. And then find ways of sneakily bringing this in across the organization.
Yeah, very well said. I, in fact, answered what I was thinking about as my next follow-up question, which is, as an employee, what action can I take now, which can actually move me towards this vision of having meaningful work, which is not urgent. Now, I can see that we have less than 5 minutes of time with us, so. A couple of questions that we always end our conversations with at the show. So the first one is there any piece of art, a book, or a video, or whatever that has had a profound impact on your work and on the way you think? Would you like to share that with our audience?
So there have been, I think, a few books that I've found to be profoundly influential. I guess one of the first ones I would recommend for readers is a book called Invisible Women. This is a book about how, when we build products without thinking about the different demographics, we're often creating products that don't necessarily work for all. And in the book, she really gives examples of how we've designed a world that works for men, but without really thinking about whether it works for women. And she gives so many examples, and you really realize we're living in a world that's not designed for us, whether it's seat belts or, just
Cities, for that
temperatures.
matter.
Cities, brilliant, great example. Whether it's cities, seat belts,
Downtown. The entire
exactly,
concept of downtown.
exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, that book is brilliant. Another book that I found profoundly influential is Permanent Record by Edward Snowden. And that book really talks about why it's so important to not erode privacy, why we need privacy for free speech and for us to exist as a democracy. Another great book, which I think is profoundly influential as you think about your product and how you might be contributing to digital pollution, which we didn't get to today. Maybe we can do another episode on that one just to focus on digital pollution. But those are two books I'd highly recommend.
Yeah, we didn't have time for digital pollution, but I think the very concept of naming something actually creates a conversation around it. And maybe this is something that we can have a separate conversation. And this is something that probably people should actually read the book to find out more about as well. So that's something that people should actually look forward to. Very, very important concept. And so the last question that we end our show always, the show is called Pushing Beyond the Obvious. So what is it that you find obvious that people miss all the time?
This idea that your product is your mechanism to create change is, now it feels obvious. And yet I think, it is a profoundly deep idea that that sounds obvious, once you really think about it for a long time and once you've internalized it. But, one of my favorite quotes from a professor we had at MIT where we were learning differential equations, he would write up these equations on the board, and then he'd go well, and it's intuitively obvious that the answer is blah. And you're sitting there thinking, no, this wasn't intuitively obvious. But then I liked another professor who would say, the answer is intuitively obvious when you know the answer. And so this is kind of the whole point of product thinking, where your product is your mechanism for creating change in the world. It feels intuitively obvious at some point, but I think first we have to start with the realization that we bring profound change in the world through our products. And so your product is the mechanism that you're using to create change. You're voting with your labor in terms of, you know, the work that you do. You are deciding what is the change you want to bring to the table, bring to the world. And that's a really important point, maybe, that I'll end with, that became clear to me as I was writing the book. But you know, it's such an important thing for us to think about. What is your vision for the world that you want to bring about? And what, think about your labor and your work that you're doing as a way of creating that change in the world. Are you creating the change that you want?
Super. Thank you so much. Can you please tell people where they can find more information about yourself, about the book? When is the book coming out, and where can they order the book?
So the book is coming out on September 28th this year, 2021. So yeah, just a few more weeks to go. And you can find the book on so many places. If you're international, I recommend Book Depository, which does free shipping anywhere. So you can find it on there. You can also find it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, at your local bookstore. Don't forget your local bookstore. And the book is called Radical Product Thinking. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I always love to hear from people who are working on creating change. And I'd love to hear your stories of how you're creating change using radical product thinking.
Thank you so much, Radhika. I think I love the book. I think it's going to be a big, phenomenal success. All the very best to you for the book. And I hope we get a chance to speak again sometime soon.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate your thoughtful and insightful questions, and for having really read the book in so much detail, like thoughtfully, and considered all these ideas.
Thank you so much.